Hey guys, and hi Emily. Tonight we begin with a group of heavily armored men who solved most of their problems by swinging pieces of metal at each other. Medieval knights. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval swords really worked the way movies claim, every knight would have walked onto the battlefield smiling, confident, and probably humming a heroic theme song. Instead, most of them walked in thinking, if this sword is the only thing standing between me and death today, then I deeply regret every decision that brought me here. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. The sword was not the star of the show. In fact, it was barely the supporting actor. Knights didn't want to use their swords. Using your sword meant that everything else had already gone catastrophically wrong. The reality behind the armor. When you think of a medieval knight, you may imagine polished armor gleaming under torchlight, dramatic sword duels, or heroic charges on horseback accompanied by trumpet blasts. That is the image shaped by movies and novels, full of action, emotion, and spectacle. But real medieval warfare was far slower, heavier, and significantly more exhausting than popular culture suggests. It was not a world of dramatic one-on-one combat staged for entertainment, but of calculated endurance, strategy, discomfort, and practicality. To understand how knights actually used their weapons, you must first step into the uncomfortable interior of their armor and the heavy realities of the battlefield. Imagine yourself standing early in the morning on a damp, dewy field somewhere in 14th century France. Fog hangs over the low grass, and the ground beneath your boots is soft and uneven from the previous night's rain. Around you, dozens of men are preparing for battle, but there is no shouting, no cinematic clash of metal, no sweeping orchestral score. Instead, you hear the dull thud of iron rivets being hammered tight, the murmured curses of squires fumbling with buckles, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of men already tired before fighting even begins. Putting on armor was an ordeal in itself. A full suit of plate armor during the late medieval period weighed around 20 to 30 kilograms, roughly the weight of a modern hiking backpack loaded for a multi-day journey. But instead of resting comfortably across the shoulders, the distribution was rigid, precise, and layered over a padded arming doublet that trapped heat against the body even in cool climates. Before a knight even lifted a weapon, he was sweating, his movement limited by metal plates that flexed only at carefully designed angles. The first thing people misunderstand is mobility. Movies often suggest that armor made knights clumsy and slow, almost robotic. But the truth is more nuanced. Knights could run, jump, and even mount horses while wearing full plate. Contemporary accounts describe men turning cartwheels in armor to demonstrate flexibility. The restriction was not the ability to move, but the energy required to sustain movement under that much weight. A short sprint might leave a knight breathless. A fall could stun him simply through the shock of impact. Every action was amplified by weight, heat, and constant pressure. Next, consider weapons. In films, knights almost always wield long swords. using wide sweeping strikes intended to slice opponents dramatically. But on real battlefields, swords were rarely the primary choice. Contrary to romantic depiction, most swords were not optimized for cutting through armor. In fact, plate armor was nearly impossible to slice through. Instead, knights carried polearms, war hammers, maces, and axes, blunt instruments designed to deliver bone-shaking concussion. A mace head crashing into a helmet would not cleave it open. Rather, it would dent metal inward, driving force into the skull beneath. The goal was not theatrical bloodshed, it was simply to disable. Sword fighting as you envision it, with dancers' footwork and quick, light slashes, belonged mostly to duels without armor or civilian conflicts. On the battlefield, swords were used more like crowbars than razor blades. Knights would invert their swords, gripping the blade with both hands, a technique known as half-swording, using the crossguard as a hook to control or trip opponents. Blades were driven into joints or gaps, under the arm, behind the knee, or through the visor slit. This sounds brutal, and it was, but it was also slow and methodical. Combat in armor was less like the elegant fencing of cinema and more like wrestling while wearing 30 kilograms of metal. Many battles devolved into grappling, where leverage, footing, and stamina mattered more than strength or weapon skill. A well-placed shove could knock an opponent to the ground, and once down, rising again was difficult. A knight on the ground might be swarmed not by sword strokes, but by men using daggers, thin, triangular blades called rondelle daggers, to force through weak points in armor. The movies rarely show how often battles were decided by fatigue, not finesse. Now consider the noise. Not the sharp ringing of perfectly synchronized swords, but the hollow booming of iron hitting iron, the grunt of exertion, the clatter of falling bodies, and the muffled thumps of impact absorbed by padded garments. Soldiers described fighting in armor as like being inside a drum. The world narrows to the air inside your helmet. Hot, stale, metallic smelling. Your field of vision shrinks to a slit barely wide enough to perceive danger, and hearing becomes a confused echo of chaos. Medieval battles were rarely the long cinematic engagements depicted on screen. Most real hand-to-hand fighting lasted only minutes before one side broke and fled. The aftermath, mud where blood mixed into pooled water, discarded equipment, wounded men crying out for help that would not come, lasted far longer than the fighting itself. A knight's responsibility continued beyond the clash of weapons, checking injuries, repairing damaged gear, tending exhausted horses, and negotiating ransoms for captured nobles. Many knights survived multiple battles without ever striking a dramatic killing blow. And then there was the horse. Movies show knights charging at full speed into enemy lines like unstoppable forces, but real cavalry charges seldom looked that way. A war horse was enormously valuable, trained for years, and easily injured. For a moment, you wonder what the day will bring. Will you survive? Will your body endure the weight long enough to fight effectively? Will your horse panic in the noise and confusion? Will your carefully polished armor be dented beyond repair? These are the questions real knights faced, far removed from the heroic simplicity of film screens. And as the distant sound of a horn finally echoes through the mist, signaling the approach of battle, you cannot help but wonder, What truly determined victory in these brutal and exhausting fights, if not the elegance and speed that modern stories portray so vividly? Strategy, formations, and the real mechanics of medieval combat. To understand how knights actually used their weapons in battle, you must step beyond the individual duel and look at the larger system of medieval warfare. The movies tend to focus on the dramatic image of lone heroes clashing in open fields, swords sparking with every strike. But real battles were slow, coordinated, and dominated by formations, discipline, and planning. A knight was not an isolated warrior performing choreographed acrobatics. He was one component in a carefully arranged structure, much like a single gear inside a large, grinding machine. Imagine again that misty morning on the battlefield. You stand among rows of soldiers arranged according to long-practiced patterns. Knights were the elite of medieval armies, but they seldom fought alone. They worked in coordination with infantry lines, archers, engineers, and support crews. A knight's role was determined by strategy, not by personal style or dramatic duel. The order of battle, nothing like Hollywood chaos. The first major misconception is the idea that battles began with spontaneous charging and wild fighting. In reality, battles unfolded in clearly defined phases. The opening phase was often a long delay, sometimes hours of positioning, scouting, and waiting for the best terrain. Terrain mattered more than courage. A battle could be won or lost before weapons were drawn. Generals preferred high ground so soldiers would not have to fight uphill. They avoided marshes and soft soil where heavy armor became a liability. Rivers could separate forces, slowing attacks and creating choke points that allowed a smaller army to withstand a larger one. A commander might delay an attack for an entire day simply because the wind was blowing dust into his soldiers' eyes rather than the enemy's. Only when conditions were favorable did armies move into formations. Infantry typically formed a long, dense line, shields locked together, spears angled outward. Behind them stood archers, crossbowmen, and artillery units such as trebuchets or early cannon in later centuries. Knights were placed on the flanks or held in reserve, waiting for the critical moment to strike. They were not the first to rush forward. They were the final blow. The role of knights in coordinated battle. When the time finally came to engage, knights did not gallop in as a chaotic mob. Instead, they moved in disciplined ranks known as convoys, often groups of 20 to 40 men trained to ride and maneuver together. These units worked as a single body, wheeling, advancing, and retreating on signal. A single knight acting independently would quickly be surrounded and overwhelmed. Coordination preserved both effectiveness and survival. A cavalry charge was not a reckless sprint. War horses, larger and stronger than common riding horses, began at a slow walk, then a trot, then a controlled canter, accelerating only near impact. This prevented the line from breaking apart. A charge had to hit with maximum force and precision. Any gap could cause the formation to collapse like loose stones tumbling from a wall. War horses were trained not only for speed, but also to bite, kick, and ram. Their sheer mass could break infantry formations if defensive lines were weak or disorganized. The primary purpose of a charge was not to smash through a solid line of spears and shields. Despite what movies show. Instead, cavalry looked for vulnerability, a flank exposed, a formation disrupted, soldiers out of breath. Knights struck when the enemy already showed signs of panic or fatigue. It was less about heroism and more about exploiting timing. But when charging failed, knights dismounted. On muddy or uneven terrain, a mounted charge was more dangerous to the rider than to the enemy. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, French knights dismounted to fight on foot after their cavalry became stuck in mud. Plate armor, made for mounted combat, now dragged their bodies into exhaustion. Many drowned face first in mud, unable to roll over or stand. Their armor did not betray them, their terrain did. This practical toolkit shows that battle was about efficiency, not elegance. A knight carrying only a sword would be poorly equipped for real fights. The sword did have symbolic importance. It was a sign of status and chivalry. Many knights used beautifully decorated blades in ceremonies and duels. But when war came, the sword was more of a backup weapon than a primary tool. Even when swords were drawn, they engaged not with slashing, but with thrusting, hooking, and levering. Movies favor wide dramatic swings that look visually impressive. In real combat, wide swings were foolish, easily intercepted, and wasted energy. Shields and defense, the real skill of survival. Another misleading image from film is the idea that knights relied solely on offense. In reality, defense mattered more. The shield was a knight's most valuable tool, especially before plate armor was common. Shields absorbed shock, deflected arrows, and preserved stamina. A shield wall, ranks of interlocking shields, was one of the strongest formations on the battlefield. Breaking a shield wall required coordinated pressure and psychological dominance. The skill of a knight was measured less by how many enemies he killed and more by how long he could remain alive. A living knight could be ransomed for money, but a dead knight was worthless. Many battles became contests of attrition, where the goal was not heroic slaughter, but wearing down opponents to the point of collapse. The psychological battlefield. Modern audiences often overlook the mental dimension of combat. Medieval warfare depended heavily on morale. Fear was as deadly as any weapon. Battles might be won simply by making the enemy believe they could not win. The sound of charging horses, the glitter of armor, the rhythmic pounding of drums, and the shouts of advancing troops were meant to break resolve before blades met. Soldiers dreaded chaos. Once formation broke, defeat followed quickly. An army that lost order often scattered, and knights did not chase fleeing soldiers dramatically through fields for glory. They pursued them because the moment of retreat was the safest moment to strike. The most decisive victories came not from killing the enemy in formation, but from capturing them during retreat. The quiet work after battle. The aftermath of battle was slow, heavy, and laborious. Knights walked the field collecting arrows, repairing armor, tending to wounded men, and caring for horses. Survivors spent hours cleaning weapons, cataloging resources, and burying comrades. A battlefield after combat was eerily quiet. There were no cinematic speeches, only exhaustion and silence. Night often fell with soldiers sleeping in armor, too tired to remove it, bodies bruised from impacts and skin rubbed raw by padding soaked in sweat. Training, repetition, not romance. Training for knighthood was not glamorous. Young squires spent years repeating basic drills, lifting heavy shields for endurance, swinging weighted weapons hundreds of times per day, wrestling for balance, riding in circles to perfect control, learning to fall without breaking limbs. Pages polished armor, cleaned stables, and memorized heraldic symbols. The life of a knight was built on practice, not passion. War was a profession, not an adventure. The reality beneath the myth. And so, when you picture a knight in battle, imagine not a hero performing remarkable feats of acrobatic combat, but a disciplined soldier performing deliberate, exhausting, repetitive actions. Imagine sweat leaking into padded cloth, visibility narrowed by a visor slit, heat pressing against skin, and weapons used to survive rather than impress. That is where the truth lies, in the slow, measured work of men fighting not for glory, but simply to stay alive. And now, with the armies positioned, the formations set, and the horn sounding once more on the misty plain, a question rises that no sword can answer. If careful planning, terrain, and discipline mattered more than dramatic heroism, then what truly decided the fate of a battle when formations finally collided in brutal close combat? The brutal collapse of formations, the aftermath of battle, and the quiet legacy. When two armies finally collided in close combat, all the carefully arranged formations, strategic planning, and disciplined preparation collapsed into a scene that felt far different from the dramatic battles familiar in modern storytelling. Movies often show clean confrontations where warriors move gracefully between opponents, swords slicing fluidly through the air. But real medieval close combat was cramped, suffocating, and overwhelming. There was little space to breathe, little time to think, and often no clear sense of where danger was coming from. To understand the true nature of medieval fighting, imagine standing inside a packed crowd, shoulder to shoulder, with men pressed tightly on every side. You cannot lift your arms freely, and every step is forced by the movement of others. The ground beneath you is churned into slippery mud, scattered with broken wood, bent arrowheads, and discarded pieces of armor. The air is thick with sweat, metal, and soil. Visibility is reduced to inches, and sound becomes a muffled roar inside the narrow steel enclosure of your helmet. You cannot see your opponent fully, only fragments, a flash of metal, a glimpse of cloth, the glint of a visor. The moment formations break. Formations did not collapse suddenly like dramatic explosions. Instead, they dissolved slowly through exhaustion, pressure, and loss of space. The pushing of bodies, the slipping of feet, and the natural human instinct to recoil from danger all contributed. Once even a small gap opened in a shield wall, panic spread like wildfire. Every man feared the enemy pouring through and breaking the line. The loss of order was more terrifying than the sight of weapons. When formations broke, fighting turned into a desperate struggle of survival. Knights no longer swung their weapons widely, not only because wide swings were impractical, but because doing so risked striking their own men. Instead, strikes were short, direct, and brutal. Many blows were not directed with style, but with blunt force, angled downward at heads and shoulders. A mace swung from inches away could collapse a visor. A poleaxe thrust like a spear could drive through weak armor around the armpit. The slow, deliberate wrestling motions seen in historical combat manuals were essential now, because grappling determined survival as much as striking. The body became a weapon as much as steel. Men shoved, tripped, and drove their shoulders into each other. Many died not from sharp wounds, but from suffocation, internal injuries, or trampling underfoot. Historical records describe piles of bodies stacking so deeply that men suffocated simply because they fell and could not rise. The ground, the most dangerous opponent. Knights and soldiers feared falling more than being struck. Once on the ground, the weight of armor pressed heavily on the lungs. The padding beneath armor absorbed water and mud like a sponge, adding weight with every second. A man pinned by bodies above him might drown in shallow puddles. Many battlefield deaths were silent and unseen. Chroniclers sometimes described battles where bodies lay stacked like sheaves of grain, and men disappeared under the press of weight. Film rarely shows this. It is hard to dramatize quiet, unseen death. But for those who lived it, the fear of losing balance was constant. Every step was treacherous, especially when the ground was churned into thick mud by hundreds of boots and hooves. At Agincourt, French knights slipped repeatedly as they tried to climb uphill under heavy rain. The English archers, lightly armored, maneuvered more easily. Terrain, once again, proved more decisive than swordsmanship. Weapons in the chaos. In this cramped press of bodies, weapons were used differently than one might expect. Swords were gripped halfway up the blade, turning them into thrusting tools and leverage bars. The edges were not sharp enough to slice through plate armor, but they were narrow enough to wedge into joints around the neck, elbow, or groin. Knights pressed the tip into gaps rather than swinging. A rondel dagger, narrow and rigid, could be hammered like a nail into visor slits. A poleaxe spike could punch through breastplate seams. A warhammer could deform metal with a single crushing blow. Even archers, once out of arrows, joined close combat, using mallets and knives. Horses became liabilities. They panicked in the noise and pressed riders into danger. A fallen horse was nearly impossible to lift, and many riders who fell beneath their mounts were crushed. There was no elegance. There was no artistry. Combat resembled a collapsing heap of bodies, metal grinding on metal, men gasping desperately inside their helmets, breath turning hot and stale. Survival over glory. Victory did not come from who fought most boldly, but from who endured the longest. Most soldiers fought only a few minutes before exhaustion forced them to retreat or collapse. The human body could not sustain the weight, heat, and effort much longer. A knight who emerged from close combat alive was often shaking, dizzy, drenched in sweat, and barely able to stand. This reality makes the romantic legends of heroic knights defeating dozens of enemies impossible. A knight who fought more than one or two opponents at once would be quickly overwhelmed. The true skill of survival lay in conserving energy, finding space to breathe, staying close to allies, and waiting for moments of weakness in an enemy line. When the enemy breaks, the outcome of battle often depended on a single moment when fear overtook discipline. Once an army broke formation and fled, defeat became inevitable. Knights pursued only once the enemy turned their backs. because then danger was minimal. Many casualties happened not in the clash itself, but in the retreat. Those who fled died in ditches, rivers, and thick forest, not in honorable duels. Capturing nobles was far more profitable than killing them. A knight could earn a fortune by capturing a wealthy lord and demanding ransom. This meant that many men were spared when defenseless, but killed when resisting. Knights did not seek glorious final blows. They sought valuable prisoners. A living noble was wealth. A dead one was waste. After the battle. Now imagine the battlefield after fighting ceased. The noise quiets. The shouting fades. The field is eerily still. You stand surrounded by broken armor, abandoned shields, and bodies lying face down in mud. Some groan softly. Others lie quietly with unnatural stillness. The air smells of sweat, iron, wet earth, and something metallic but strangely sweet, the scent of blood. There is no triumphant music, no cheering. Victory brings only relief and silence. The decline of the night, the rise of gunpowder, and how history remembers the warrior in armor. As the medieval world moved steadily toward the dawn of the early modern era, the role of the knight began to change. The heavily armored warrior on horseback had dominated European warfare for centuries, shaping not only military technology and political power, but also culture, literature, and social structure. Yet the forces that would transform the battlefield were already emerging long before anyone realized how drastically they would alter the course of history. To understand the decline of the knight, imagine once more standing in an open field, the same kind of field where battles have been fought for hundreds of years. The mist is thinning, and the morning sun rises slowly over low hills. You hear the distant sound of marching feet, an army approaching not on horseback, but on foot, in tightly ordered ranks. Their weapons are not swords or spears, but long wooden poles ending in steel hooks and spikes. And behind them, another sound emerges, sharp cracks like snapping wood, repeated in uneven rhythm. It is the unfamiliar sound of early gunpowder weapons. This is the beginning of a new era. Gunpowder and the changing face of war. Gunpowder had reached Europe from China by the late 13th century, but it took centuries to refine and adapt it for battlefield use. Early firearms were unreliable, wildly inaccurate, and slow to reload. They were smoky, loud, and frightening even to those who used them. Cannons shattered more frequently than they fired correctly, sometimes injuring their own crews. For decades, knights dismissed gunpowder as a crude novelty, dangerous but not truly threatening to armored cavalry. But slowly, battlefields began to change. First came small portable firearms, hand cannons, matchlocks, and arquebus. These early guns could penetrate armor, especially at close range. The most expensive and durable plate armor, built to withstand arrows and sword strikes, could not withstand a lead ball driven by explosive force. A knight who had invested a fortune in armor suddenly found himself vulnerable to a poorly trained soldier with a barrel of metal and a burning match cord. At the same time, military formations evolved. Infantry armed with pikes formed massive blocks called pike squares, capable of stopping cavalry charges with dense, bristling walls of steel points. Behind them stood rows of gunners who fired volleys and then retreated to reload. The combination created a deadly machine: long spears to repel horses and gunfire to destroy armored men before they could close the distance. The Battle of Pavia in 1525 was one of the defining moments that revealed the end of the knightly age. The heavily armored French cavalry, the elite of Europe, charged Spanish infantry armed with pikes and arquebus. They expected to break the line and scatter the foot soldiers as knights had done for centuries. Instead, they were cut down in shocking numbers. The armored knight, once the master of battle, had become obsolete in a matter of minutes. Armor becomes heavier, then disappears. In response to gunpowder, armorers attempted to strengthen plate armor. Suits grew thicker and heavier, some tested by firing pistols directly at the breastplate to verify protection. These proof marks became symbols of pride. But as firearms improved, armor could not keep pace. It grew too heavy for movement and too expensive for armies growing rapidly in size. By the late 16th century, full-plate armor disappeared from the battlefield. Knights abandoned their iconic appearance. Only helmets and breastplates remained, and eventually even those faded away. Horses, once the symbol of noble warfare, became targets rather than assets. The knight's traditional weapons also declined. Polearms evolved into standardized infantry weapons. The longsword became ceremonial. The lance disappeared almost entirely. War became defined not by individual duels, but by coordinated volleys of gunfire, geometric formations, logistics, supply chains, and mathematical planning. The knight's world of personal valor and chivalric identity was giving way to cold precision and organized state militaries. The transformation of social power. The decline of the knight was not only a military change, it reshaped European society. For centuries, knights had held power through land ownership and military obligation. Kings depended on them to raise armies. But gunpowder armies required money, not feudal service. Monarchs began to fund standing armies through taxation rather than through noble loyalty. The balance of power shifted. Wealth moved from land to trade. Merchants gained influence. Central governments grew stronger. The feudal pyramid that had defined medieval life slowly dissolved. Castles, once unbeatable strongholds, crumbled before cannon fire. Stone walls that had stood for centuries cracked and collapsed under bombardment. The heart of medieval authority turned to rubble. Siege warfare changed as well. Instead of months or years of patient starvation sieges, cannon could breach walls within days. Defensive design shifted to the star-shaped fortresses with angled walls that could deflect cannon shot. Fortifications suited not for knights, but for engineers and mathematicians. Everything that knights represented, personal combat, noble identity, chivalric honor, was fading. Chivalry becomes myth. Even as knights disappeared from the battlefield, their image grew stronger in storytelling. In the late Middle Ages and beyond, poets, priests, and chroniclers began to romanticize the knightly past. They wrote songs, epics, and legends that painted knights as paragons of purity and courage. Arthurian tales flourished. Courtly romances spread. The knight became a symbol of moral virtue rather than a practical soldier. The more knights vanished from reality, the brighter they shone in imagination. The truth they left behind was far less glamorous. Sweat, exhaustion, mud, fear, and endless routine. But history is shaped not only by fact, but also by memory. People longed for a noble past in a rapidly changing world of gunpowder and bureaucracy. And so, the knight became something he never was in life, a myth carved from nostalgic longing. What remains today? If you walk through a museum today and see a suit of plate armor gleaming under polished lights, you may feel awe at its beauty. The smooth curves of steel, the intricate engravings, and the symmetry of its construction seem more like art than weaponry. But remember what it represented: tremendous weight on tired shoulders, bruises hidden beneath padding, cracked ribs from blunt impact, restricted breath, narrow vision, and the constant threat of suffocation or trampled death. And yet, within that burden lived something remarkable: endurance. Knights were not superheroes, but human beings shaped by discipline, training, and duty. They survived harsh conditions and navigated the exhaustion of war. They lived in a world where every decision, every piece of equipment, and every hour of preparation determined whether they lived or died. Their weapons were not instruments of glory, but tools of necessity. Their victories came from timing, terrain, and patience. Their defeats often came from weather, mud, and fatigue. In many ways, knights embodied the quiet truth of human struggle. Survival comes not from brilliance, but from endurance. The last reflection. So now, as you imagine once more the quiet battlefield after the smoke has cleared and the bodies are collected, you see a figure sitting alone beside his helmet. A knight who has survived the fight, but knows the world is changing around him. His armor is dented, his weapon chipped, his muscles trembling with fatigue. He breathes deeply, the taste of metal still heavy in his mouth. He looks across the field not with triumph, but with quiet awareness. He has lived through the end of an era. The weapons that served him faithfully will soon be relics behind glass. The skills he mastered since childhood will no longer decide battles. The world moves forward without him. And as he watches soldiers carrying gunpowder and pikes across the horizon, he realizes that the age of armored heroes is ending, not with a dramatic clash, but with a slow and inevitable surrender to time. And so you are left with a final question to ponder as the field grows silent and the sky shifts from gray to pale blue. In the end, what do we choose to remember more? The mythic legend of shining armor and heroic battles, or the quiet truth of sweat, endurance, and the ordinary labor that shaped real history beneath the polished surface of myth? Waking to the rhythm of labor and survival. When you picture medieval Europe, your mind might first travel to grand castles, royal courts, and shining knights like those in the previous story. But the real backbone of medieval society was not the noble class. It was the peasants. Nearly 90% of all people in the Middle Ages lived as peasants, working the land, producing the food, and supporting the structure upon which kings, lords, and warriors depended. Their lives were governed not by glory, but by necessity. Without their quiet endurance, castles would crumble, armies would starve, and the great stories of kings would have never been written. To understand the true nature of medieval life, imagine waking not in a castle, but in a low, smoky, timber-framed hut on a cold, early morning in the 13th century. Outside, the sky is still dim, touched faintly by the first pale light of dawn. Roosters crow in the distance. A soft wind moves through the trees, pushing smoke from the chimney into the gray morning air. Inside, the one-room dwelling is dark except for the faint amber glow of dying embers in the central hearth. The floor beneath you is packed earth, uneven and cool to the touch. You lie beneath a rough wool blanket, stiff with use, shared with your family for warmth through the night. There are no soft mattresses here, only straw piled into a coarse sack, flattened and prickly. The air smells of smoke, dried herbs hung from beams, livestock that slept inside the house for warmth, and damp wool. A medieval peasant rarely slept alone or in privacy. Families shared space, heat, and belongings out of necessity, not preference. There are no clocks, no alarms, no windows of glass. You wake because light has begun to seep through gaps in the shutters, because the cold has settled deep into your bones, and because work awaits. The rhythm of life is not measured by hours, but by natural cycles: sunrise, sunset, and the passing of seasons. Time is not something you control. It moves you, rising to begin the day. The first task is to rekindle the fire. Fire is precious. The flames that warmed you the night before are now reduced to dull orange coals buried beneath ash. If they go out completely, you must walk to a neighbor to borrow embers, an hour lost before work even begins. You gather thin twigs and dried moss and blow gently, coaxing new flame to life. Smoke rises in soft white curls, prickling your eyes. Around you, your family wakes slowly. Children rub sleep from their eyes. Your spouse wraps a shawl around their shoulders, moving stiffly toward the small wooden table where a bowl of dried barley awaits. The youngest whimpers softly from the cold. You carry a clay jar outside to fetch water from the nearby village well. The morning air stings your skin. Your breath clouds in front of you. A thin layer of frost crunches under your feet. Life for a peasant begins and ends with labor. Breakfast, simple and repetitive. Food is scarce and unvaried. For breakfast, there is no feast, only pottage, the staple of medieval peasants. Pottage is a thick stew made from whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, turnips, cabbage, sometimes dried peas or beans. If fortunate, there might be a small piece of fatty meat left from the last slaughter, but more often the flavor comes only from herbs and salt. Alongside it, there is coarse black bread made from rye or barley, dense and dark, cut with a knife whose blade is dull from use. Wheat bread is a luxury reserved for lords and special holy days. Fresh eggs, sweet fruit, and dairy are rare treats. Most meals taste the same from day to day, month to month. Hunger is a familiar companion. While you eat, you listen to the sounds of the village around you: a dog barking, a bucket clanging against the stone well, the distant call of the church bell marking the first prayer of the day. Religion is deeply woven into the structure of life. The bells rhythmically divide time, and the church calendar dictates the pace of work and rest. But rest is infrequent. There are more days of labor than holy days. Preparing for work on the manor, most peasants are serfs, tied to the land of a local lord. You do not own the fields you cultivate. In exchange for protection and a place to live, you owe days of unpaid labor to the lord, plowing his fields, repairing his roads, harvesting his crops. Only after fulfilling these obligations can you work your own small plot, trying to grow enough grain and vegetables to feed your family. You step outside into the pale, cool morning. Smoke rises from the chimneys scattered across the village. Chickens scratch at the dirt for scraps. A few goats bleat, tethered beside huts. In the distance, a man leads 2 oxen strapped to a heavy wooden plow. The fields stretch outward, brown and empty this time of year, waiting for planting. The social order surrounds you clearly. The manor house sits higher on a small hill, overlooking the village, flanked by barns and stables. You will work on that land today, along with dozens of others. The Lord may not appear. Most of the work is supervised by a steward or bailiff. But his authority is everywhere, visible in the fields, the tools, and the tithe barn where you must deposit a share of your crops after harvest. Tools of labor, simplicity over efficiency. The tools you use are simple but heavy. A wooden-handled hoe, a dull iron spade, a rake with uneven teeth, a plow pulled by animals, not machines. Everything must be repaired by hand. Iron is expensive. A broken tool might mean days of lost work. You carry the hoe over your shoulder, feeling the worn wood smooth from years of handling. There is no glory in these tools, only necessity. They determine survival. Life in the fields. Work begins shortly after sunrise. You join others from the village as they gather on the edge of the field. There is little talking. Conversations are brief and practical. Strength must be conserved. The ground is hard from the night's freeze, and the first thrust of the spade into the soil requires force. Your back bends. Your hands ache. The cold turns to sweat quickly. The hours pass slowly. You lift, dig, bend, pull. The rhythm is repetitive and hypnotic. This is the nature of medieval life. Cycles, repetition, and endurance. There are no machines to ease burden, no fuel but muscle. At mid-morning, there is a short pause to drink water and eat another piece of bread. Then labor resumes. For peasants, work is not something that waits. It consumes the day. The weight of obligation. Even as you work, you think ahead. You must plant enough crops to feed your family through the winter. You must save seed for next year. You must pay rent to the Lord, give tithes to the church, save rope and wood for repairs, and set aside wool for clothing. A bad harvest means hunger. Hunger means debt. Debt means punishment. Everything in your life balances on the fragile edge of survival. Unlike the knight, whose fears were born on the battlefield, the peasant's fears live in the soil. Too much rain, too little rain, early frost, pests, disease. A year of hardship can destroy years of labor. Midday meal, taken in the fields. At midday, the group stops work to eat again. The food is the same pottage as breakfast, carried in a wooden bowl wrapped in cloth. You eat with your hands or with a wooden spoon. Conversation drifts slowly across the group, but topics rarely change. Weather, crop yield, illness, and the Lord's demands. Gossip is one of the few sources of entertainment. There is no concept of leisure as modern people know it. Rest is brief and practical. Returning to work. After eating, work resumes through the afternoon. The sun moves slowly across the sky. Sweat stings your eyes. The muscles in your back tighten. Time stretches. You do not choose when to stop. Nature and obligation dictate everything. Finally, as sunlight begins to fade, work ends. The steward counts workers and tools. You return home in silence, drained. Evening in the village. Back at the hut, smoke rises again from the hearth. Your spouse tends the fire, stirring another pot of pottage. The children chase each other outdoors, kicking a ball made of tightly wound rags. Chickens settle for the night, rustling in straw. Dinner tastes no different from breakfast or lunch. You sit together around the fire, sharing silence and warmth. Laughter is rare, but companionship is steady. The flames throw soft shadows across the timber walls. The noise of the day softens into the quiet crackle of burning wood. There is still work to do, repairing worn clothes, sharpening tools, patching holes in the roof, checking livestock. Life is maintenance. Life is repetition. Preparing for sleep. Night settles early. Candles are expensive and used sparingly. When the fire burns low, darkness wraps the room. You lie down again on the straw mattress, muscles aching, body weary. Outside, the wind rustles through the thatch roof. The moon glows faintly through broken clouds. Sleep comes quickly, not through peace, but through exhaustion. Tomorrow will be the same. The rhythm does not change. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Survival is the only measure of success. And as your eyes close, you wonder quietly, how did peasants endure such endless labor year after year, generation after generation, without hope of escaping the life into which they were born? Hunger, hardship, faith, and the turning of seasons. To continue understanding the quiet endurance of medieval peasants, you must step deeper into the reality of their daily existence. Not just the work in the fields, but the challenges that shaped every aspect of their lives. The rhythm of labor dominated each day, but the forces that controlled peasant life extended far beyond the boundaries of the farmland. Hunger, illness, weather, taxes, and faith formed the framework through which medieval peasants learned to navigate survival. Their world was not guided by ambition or choice, but by necessity and resignation. Imagine waking again in the dim morning light, your back aching from yesterday's labor. The fire on the hearth is cold now, reduced to ash. As you rise from the straw mattress, your fingers search for warmth that is not there. Outside, frost coats the rooftops, and the early morning air carries a biting chill. Winter is approaching, a season that brings as much fear as rest. You pull on a coarse wool tunic, stiff and itchy. Clothing for peasants is simple and functional. There is no wardrobe or selection to consider. Most people owned only one or two sets of clothing. A tunic, a belt, sturdy hose, and heavy leather shoes for men. A long wool dress, an apron, and a kerchief for women. Everything is hand-stitched, patched repeatedly until the fabric thins into threads. Cloth is precious. Every scrap is saved, reused, and repurposed. Children's clothing is often passed down until it disintegrates. Hunger, a constant companion. Food for peasants was always uncertain. Even in a good year, meals were small and repetitive. In a bad year, famine loomed like a shadow that never left. A single failed harvest could mean months of hunger. Grain molds easily, meat spoils quickly, and vegetables rot. Without refrigeration or preservation, food must be carefully rationed. Portions shrink as winter stretches on. The diet of a peasant relied heavily on pottage, a slow-cooked stew made from root vegetables, grains and herbs. Bread, dense and dark, filled the stomach but offered little comfort. Meat appeared rarely, usually only when a village animal died or during religious holidays. Dairy was limited, reserved mostly for children. Fruit and sweet foods were luxuries beyond imagination. And hunger shapes the mind. It narrows attention, sharpens worry, and turns time into waiting. Eating was not pleasure, it was survival. Every winter brought fear. Would the food last until spring? Would a new season bring relief? Many families supplemented their diet with whatever they could gather: nettles, mushrooms, berries, and nuts. But these too depended on nature's unpredictable generosity, illness, and the fragility of life. Medical knowledge was limited. Disease spread quickly through villages, and living conditions made prevention nearly impossible. People lived close to animals, walked barefoot through mud, and slept crowded together. Waste disposal was crude. Water contamination was common. A simple infection could become fatal within days. There were no hospitals, only priests and herbal healers. Remedies included poultices, teas, bleeding, and prayers. Illness was seen not only as a physical condition, but as a sign of spiritual imbalance or divine punishment. Many believed that suffering purified the soul. Child mortality was extremely high. Many families lost half their children before adulthood. Mothers gave birth at home, without trained assistance. Complications were frequent. Death was a constant presence, woven into life like a familiar guest. Yet peasants endured, because endurance was the only choice. Housing, shelter in name more than comfort. Peasant houses were small, dark, and smoky. Most were built from wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with woven branches and coated in mud. Thatch roofs leaked during storms, and repairs were constant. The floor was packed dirt, sometimes layered with straw to absorb moisture. When it rained, water seeped through cracks and pooled inside. There was no chimney. Smoke from the central fire drifted upward and escaped through holes in the roof, filling the room with haze. Breathing was difficult at times, and smoke blackened the inside walls. The smell clung to clothing and skin. Livestock, pigs, goats, chickens, were often brought indoors during winter nights for warmth. You can imagine the sounds: the restless shuffle of hooves, the soft clucking of hens, the occasional bleating. Life and survival were intimately connected. A sick animal could mean hunger for the family. A stolen animal could mean ruin. Privacy did not exist. Families slept side by side. Intimacy was shared with silence rather than seclusion. Life was communal, not individual. Work beyond the fields. Even after long days of labor, peasants returned home to more work. Tools must be repaired. Fishing nets must be tied. Wool must be spun. Bread must be made. Clothes must be washed by hand in cold water drawn from the well. There is no rest that is not earned. Women's labor was constant and unseen. They cooked, cleaned, harvested vegetables, cared for children, and often worked fields alongside men. Children worked as soon as they could walk. Boys tended livestock and gathered firewood. Girls fetched water and ground grain. Play existed briefly, woven into chores. Faith as structure and consolation. Religion permeated daily life. The church calendar dictated time. Bells marked morning prayer, midday prayer, and evening prayer. Each week was structured around the Massachusetts. Dozens of holy days offered breaks from labor, though they were often replaced with mandatory attendance and processions. Peasants believed deeply in heaven and hell. Suffering on earth was seen as preparation for salvation. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every exhaustion carried the promise of reward beyond death. Life was short. Eternity was long. This belief supported millions through lives that offered little earthly comfort. The local priest was often the only literate person in the village. He recorded births, marriages, and deaths, and served as a voice of authority. The church demanded tithes, often a tenth of all harvests, further tightening the burden on peasant families. Yet peasants rarely questioned faith. It was not merely religion. It was structure, community, and hope, marks of status and obligation. The lord of the manor governed land and enforced rules. Peasants owed him labor several days a week, and additional payments in the form of crops, animals, eggs, or bread. Tools and mills were controlled by the lord. Even using the grain mill required a fee. Punishments for disobedience were harsh. Fines, confiscation of land, public humiliation, and in some cases imprisonment. Peasants had little legal protection. They were bound to the land by birth, unable to leave without permission, unable to choose their occupation, unable to improve their condition. Mobility was rare and risky. Freedom, as modern people understand it, was a foreign concept. The turning of seasons. The weight of life changed with the seasons. Spring was the busiest, plowing, planting, repairing damage from winter. Summer was filled with constant labor, long days under the hot sun. Autumn brought harvest, the most crucial moment of the year. Every hand worked the fields. Every grain gathered mattered. Failure meant hunger and fear. Winter brought early darkness, deep cold, and stillness. Work continued indoors, but time slowed. There was space to think, though too often those thoughts returned to worry. Seasons shaped identity. The land was not merely soil, it was fate, moments of human warmth. Yet despite hardship, there were small joys. Music played on a simple flute, dancing on feast days, storytelling by firelight, weddings celebrated with laughter and song, neighbors helping repair a roof after a storm, bread shared with someone who had none, children chasing each other through fields after chores. And in these moments, life felt briefly more than survival. These fleeting joys, though quiet and ordinary, carried deep meaning. Before sleep arrives again, your thoughts drift to the future. Your children will inherit your land obligations. Their lives will mirror yours. Change is unlikely. Hope is small, but not absent. And so, as you rest your head again on the straw mattress, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the wind pressing against the walls, a quiet question forms. How did medieval peasants endure lives so bounded by hardship, yet find the strength to continue forward through years of labor, hunger, and endless repetition?